I never thought that one single moment could change everything. But sometimes, life has a way of breaking you down completely before it builds you back up into something unrecognizable. My name is Sophia, and this is the story of how I went from being the poorest girl in town to discovering I was worth more than I ever imagined possible. It was a Tuesday morning in September when my world came crashing down. I was working as a cleaning lady at Henderson & Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. I had been there for 3 years, invisible to most people, just another face that emptied their trash cans and cleaned their expensive marble floors. But I needed that job desperately. It was the only thing standing between me and complete homelessness. That morning, I was cleaning the conference room when I overheard Mr. Henderson talking to his business partners about a charity event they were hosting. They were discussing donations and guest lists when one of them mentioned needing someone to serve drinks at the event. That's when Mr. Henderson noticed me. "You know what?" he said, pointing directly at me. "We could save money on catering staff. Sophia here could serve the drinks. She's used to being invisible anyway." The room erupted in laughter, but Mr. Henderson wasn't done yet. "Actually, let's make this interesting," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sophia, you're always complaining about your financial situation. Here's your chance to see how the other half lives. You can serve drinks at our charity gala this weekend. Maybe you'll learn something about success from people who actually matter." I felt my cheeks burning with shame as everyone in the room stared at me. My hands were shaking as I gripped the cleaning spray tighter. I wanted to run, to disappear, to never show my face again, but I couldn't afford to lose this job. "Of course, Mr. Henderson," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "Excellent," he smirked. "And Sophia, make sure you dress appropriately. We can't have you embarrassing us in front of our distinguished guests. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been made to feel like you don't matter because of your circumstances, then please hit that subscribe button, because what happened next changed everything. And I want to share this incredible journey with people who understand what it feels like to be counted out." As I left that conference room, carrying my cleaning supplies with tears threatening to spill from my eyes, I had no idea that this humiliation would be the catalyst for the most extraordinary discovery of my life. Because sometimes, the universe has a funny way of preparing us for something bigger than we could ever imagine. That weekend, I showed up to the charity gala wearing the only black dress I owned, a simple secondhand piece I had bought at a thrift store 2 years earlier. It was clean and pressed, but compared to the designer gowns floating around the ballroom, I might as well have been wearing a garbage bag. The event was everything I expected it to be, a parade of wealth and status. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on marble floors, and the air was thick with expensive perfume and the sound of clinking champagne glasses. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling drinks and clearing plates, completely invisible to the guests who were busy discussing their latest vacation homes and business acquisitions. But then something strange happened. As I was serving champagne near the silent auction table, an elderly woman approached me. She was elegantly dressed in a deep purple gown, with silver hair styled in a perfect chignon and jewelry that probably cost more than I made in a year. What struck me most were her eyes. They were studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Excuse me, dear," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "What did you say your name was?" "Sophia, ma'am. Sophia Martinez," I replied, wondering if I had done something wrong. The woman's face went completely pale. She reached out and gently touched my arm, her fingers trembling slightly. "Martinez," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the name on her tongue. "And how old are you, child?" 24, ma'am." I watched as her eyes filled with tears she was trying desperately to hold back. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. For a moment, we just stood there in the middle of this opulent ballroom, two strangers connected by something I couldn't understand. "Your mother," she finally whispered. "What was her name?" "Isabella Martinez," I answered, confused by the personal nature of her questions. "But she died when I was very young. I barely remember her." The elderly woman's hand flew to her chest, and she took a step backward as if I had physically struck her. The champagne glass in her other hand began to shake. "Isabella," she breathed. "Dear God, it can't be." Before I could ask what she meant, Mr. Henderson appeared beside us, his face flushed with anger. "Sophia, what are you doing bothering Mrs. Whitmore? Get back to work immediately," he snapped. But Mrs. Whitmore held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Actually, Mr. Henderson, I was the one bothering this lovely young woman," she said, her voice suddenly carrying an authority that made him take a step back. "Sophia, isn't it? I wonder if you might have a moment to speak with me privately when you finish your duties this evening." She pressed a small card into my palm, and I felt the weight of expensive cardstock between my fingers. "Please," she added, her eyes never leaving mine. "It's quite important." As she walked away, I looked down at the card. It was simple and elegant. Eleanor Whitmore, with a phone number written in beautiful script below. But it was the embossed crest at the top that made my heart skip a beat. A family coat of arms featuring 2 lions and a crown, with words I couldn't read in what looked like Latin. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I went through the motions of serving and cleaning, but my mind was racing with questions. Who was Eleanor Whitmore? Why had she reacted so strongly to my mother's name? And why did she want to speak with me privately? When the last guest finally left, and I had finished cleaning up, I found myself standing in the empty ballroom, staring at that card. Something deep in my gut told me that this conversation would change everything. I just had no idea how right I was. 3 days later, I found myself sitting in the most luxurious office I had ever seen. Eleanor Whitmore's law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown skyscraper, and her personal office was a masterpiece of old-world elegance mixed with modern sophistication. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, while antique furniture and priceless artwork created an atmosphere of quiet power and wealth. Mrs. Whitmore sat across from me, her manner completely different from the emotional woman I had met at the gala. Now she was composed, professional, and utterly focused. She had spent the first few minutes of our meeting asking me detailed questions about my family history, my childhood, and especially about my mother. "Sophia," she began, her voice gentle but serious, "what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully and keep an open mind." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder that looked like it had been sitting there for decades. The edges were yellowed with age, and I could see numerous official-looking documents inside. "Your mother, Isabella Martinez, was not who you think she was," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "Her real name was Isabella Rosewood, and she was my client for many years." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "I don't understand." "Rosewood? But my name is Martinez because of my father. Your father was Jose Martinez, yes. But your mother chose to take his name and hide her true identity for reasons that will become clear shortly." Mrs. Whitmore opened the folder and pulled out a photograph that made my breath catch in my throat. It was my mother, but not as I had ever seen her. In this picture, she was wearing an elegant evening gown and standing next to a man in a tuxedo in what appeared to be a grand ballroom. She looked radiant, confident, and unmistakably wealthy. Isabella Rosewood was the sole heir to the Rosewood textile fortune, Mrs. Whitmore explained. Her family built an empire in the early 1900s that was worth millions. When her parents died in a car accident 25 years ago, Isabella inherited everything. My head was spinning. This couldn't be real. My mother had died when I was 3 years old, and I had grown up in foster care because there was no family and no money. None of this made sense. But if she inherited all this money, why was I left with nothing? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew sad. "Because your mother made a choice. She fell in love with your father, a good man, but from a completely different world. Her family's wealth came with expectations, obligations, and a lifestyle that she ultimately rejected. She walked away from it all to build a simple life with Jose." She pulled out another document, a legal paper covered in official seals and signatures. But Isabella was smart. She knew that someday you might need that inheritance, so she created a very specific trust. The money was to be held until you either came looking for it, or until you proved yourself worthy of the responsibility it represents. Proved myself worthy? What does that mean? Mrs. Whitmore smiled for the first time since I had arrived. "It means, my dear Sophia, that you are potentially worth $12 million. But there's a catch. To claim your inheritance, you must demonstrate that you can handle not just the money, but the power and responsibility that comes with it." I felt like I was going to faint. $12 million? It was an impossible number, more money than I could even conceptualize. "The trust your mother created requires you to face 3 challenges," Mrs. Whitmore continued. 3 tests that will prove you have learned the values she hoped to pass on to you: integrity, courage, and compassion. Complete these challenges successfully, and the inheritance is yours. She leaned forward, her eyes intense and serious. "But Sophia, I must warn you, the moment word gets out about this inheritance, You will face opposition from people you trust, betrayal from those closest to you, and challenges that will test every aspect of your character. The question is, are you ready to fight for what's rightfully yours? As I sat there, staring at the documents that proved my mother had been secretly wealthy all along, I realized that my life had just taken a turn I never could have imagined. The girl who had been humiliated just days ago for being poor was about to discover that she was worth more than most people could dream of. But first, I had to prove I deserved it. Mrs. Whitmore handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in elegant script across the front. "Your first challenge is inside," she said. "But before you open it, I need you to understand something crucial. These challenges were designed by your mother specifically for you, based on the kind of person she hoped you would become. They won't be easy, and they certainly won't be what you expect." With trembling hands, I broke the wax seal and pulled out a single sheet of cream-colored paper. The message was written in my mother's handwriting. I recognized it from the few birthday cards I had kept from my early childhood. "My dearest Sophia," it read, "if you are reading this, then you have discovered the truth about our family. Your first challenge is simple in concept, but difficult in execution. You must return to the place where you have been treated the worst and offer genuine help to someone who has shown you no kindness. Only by demonstrating grace in the face of cruelty will you prove that wealth will not corrupt your heart. You have 1 week to complete this task. Trust your instincts, and remember that true power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." I looked up at Mrs. Whitmore, my mind racing. "Henderson and Associates," I said quietly. "I have to go back there." She nodded. "I suspected as much. Your mother was very specific about these challenges needing to test your character in real-world situations. The next morning, I walked through the doors of Henderson and Associates for what I thought would be the last time. I had resigned via email the day before, explaining that I had found a new opportunity. What I hadn't mentioned was that I was about to put myself in an incredibly vulnerable position. I found Mr. Henderson in his office, reviewing case files with his usual air of self-importance. When he saw me standing in his doorway, his expression shifted to one of annoyed confusion. "Sophia, what are you doing here? I thought you quit." "I did, Mr. Henderson, but I wanted to speak with you about something important." He gestured impatiently to a chair across from his desk. "Make it quick. I have a deposition in 20 minutes. I took a deep breath and dove in. "I know you're handling the Morrison divorce case, and I know you're struggling with some of the financial documentation." His eyebrows shot up. "How could you possibly know anything about my cases?" "Because I pay attention, Mr. Henderson. I've been cleaning your office for 3 years, and I've seen you working late nights on that case, looking frustrated and overwhelmed." This was true. Morrison versus Morrison was a high-profile divorce involving millions of dollars in hidden assets, and Mr. Henderson had been visibly stressed about it for months. "I also know," I continued, "that you're having trouble locating some offshore accounts that Mrs. Morrison suspects her husband is hiding." Now I had his full attention. He leaned forward, his previous dismissiveness replaced by genuine interest. "Go on. If you're watching this and you've ever had to swallow your pride to do the right thing, hit that like button, because what I was about to do was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, and it was just the beginning." Before I worked as a cleaning lady, I spent 2 years studying accounting and computer forensics at community college. I couldn't afford to finish my degree, but I learned enough to recognize patterns in financial documents. "I think I can help you find those hidden accounts." Mr. Henderson stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me for the first time. "You're serious?" "Completely serious. And I'm offering to help you pro bono. No payment, no recognition, no strings attached." "Why would you do that? Especially after—" He trailed off, perhaps remembering his cruel words from the previous week. "Because everyone deserves a fair divorce settlement, Mr. Henderson. Even if you don't think I deserve basic human decency." The words hung in the air between us. I watched as something shifted in his expression. Shame, perhaps, or maybe just surprise. "Sophia, that was inappropriate of me to say those things at the gala." "It was, but I'm not here for an apology. I'm here because I have skills that could help, and helping people is the right thing to do." For the next 6 hours, I worked alongside Mr. Henderson and his team, using everything I had learned about financial forensics to trace the hidden money trail. It turned out that Mr. Morrison had been far more creative with his asset hiding than anyone had realized, using a complex network of shell companies and cryptocurrency transactions. By the end of the day, We had uncovered over $2.3 million in hidden assets that Mrs. Morrison was legally entitled to in the divorce settlement. Mr. Henderson looked at me with something approaching respect for the first time in 3 years. Sophia, this is extraordinary work. You've potentially saved this case. I'm glad I could help. Listen, I know I've been difficult. Would you consider coming back to work here? Not as cleaning staff, but as a paralegal? I could help you finish your degree, and we could use someone with your skills. I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the money I might inherit. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. That's very generous, but I have some other opportunities I need to explore first. As I left the office that evening, I felt like I had passed some kind of test. Not just my mother's challenge, but a personal one as well. I had proven to myself that I could respond to cruelty with kindness, and that felt more valuable than any inheritance. But I was about to learn that not everyone was happy about my newfound confidence. 2 days after completing my first challenge, I was walking home from the grocery store when I noticed a black sedan following me. It stayed exactly 3 cars behind me as I made several random turns, confirming my suspicions. When I finally reached my small apartment building, the car parked across the street and didn't move. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the hallway made me jump, and I found myself checking the locks on my door multiple times. The next morning, the sedan was gone, but I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. My phone rang as I was making coffee. The number was blocked, but something told me to answer. Sophia Martinez? The voice was male, professional, and completely unfamiliar. Yes? My name is David Rosewood. I believe you've recently learned that you're my cousin. My blood ran cold. Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned that there might be family members who weren't happy about my inheritance, but she hadn't given me specific names. I'd like to meet with you today. There are some things about the Rosewood family that you need to understand before you get in over your head. I don't think that's a good idea, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, but I think it is. You see, Sophia, there are legal challenges to your mother's trust that you're not aware of. Challenges that could tie up that inheritance for years, possibly decades. Unless, of course, we can come to some kind of arrangement. The threat was clear, even though his tone remained polite. What kind of arrangement? Meet me at Cafe Luna on 5th Street at 2 p.m. today. Come alone, and we'll discuss your options. The line went dead. I immediately called Mrs. Whitmore, but her secretary told me she was in court all day and couldn't be reached. I was on my own. Cafe Luna was a small, quiet place in a part of town I rarely visited. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table near the back where I could see everyone coming and going. At exactly 2 p.m., a man in an expensive suit walked in and approached my table. David Rosewood looked like he could have been my mother's brother. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same elegant bone structure. But where my mother had been warm and kind in my memories, David radiated cold calculation. Sophia, he said, sitting down without being invited. You look remarkably like Isabella. It's quite unsettling, actually. What do you want, David? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Straight to the point. I like that. What I want is very simple. I want you to walk away from this inheritance nonsense and go back to your normal life. And why would I do that? Because the alternative is going to be very unpleasant for you. He pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. These are the legal documents I filed yesterday challenging the validity of your mother's trust. I have 3 of the best estate lawyers in the country working on this case, and they've found some very interesting discrepancies. I looked at the screen, trying to make sense of the legal language. What kind of discrepancies? Well, for starters, there's the question of whether Isabella was mentally competent when she created the trust. She had just given birth to you, after all, and postpartum depression can seriously affect decision-making capabilities. I felt anger rising in my chest. You're going to claim my mother was mentally ill? If necessary, yes. There's also the matter of undue influence. Your father was a very persuasive man, and Isabella was quite vulnerable after her parents' death. It's entirely possible that he manipulated her into creating this trust to benefit you at the expense of her blood relatives. That's ridiculous. My father died when I was 10 years old, and we never had any money. But you see, that's exactly what we would expect if he had been planning something like this all along. David leaned back in his chair, looking pleased with himself. Here's what's going to happen, Sophia. You're going to publicly renounce any claim to the Rosewood inheritance. In exchange, I'll make sure these legal challenges disappear, and I'll even give you a generous settlement, let's say $50,000, to help you start a new life somewhere far away from here. And if I refuse, then I'll destroy you." His pleasant demeanor vanished completely. "I'll drag you and your parents' memory through the courts for years. I'll make sure every humiliating detail of your childhood in foster care becomes public record. I'll hire private investigators to dig up every mistake you've ever made, every embarrassing moment, every personal failure, and I'll make sure it all gets published in the newspapers." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And that's just the beginning. I have connections in this city that you can't imagine. I can make sure you never get another job, never rent another apartment, never have a moment's peace. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging to take that $50,000. I stared at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of his threats. This man had the power to make my life a living hell, and he clearly had no qualms about using it. "I need time to think about it," I said finally. "You have 24 hours. After that, the offer goes down to $25,000, and the legal challenges get much worse." He stood up and dropped a business card on the table. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Sophia. Walk away now, while you still can." As I watched him leave the cafe, I realized that my journey to claim my inheritance was going to be far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. But I also realized something else. I wasn't the same frightened girl who had been humiliated in that conference room just a week ago. I was Isabella Rosewood's daughter, and I was ready to fight. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about David's threats. Part of me wanted to take his money and run. $50,000 was more than I had ever dreamed of having, but every time I considered it, I thought about my mother and the challenges she had created for me. She had believed I was strong enough to handle this inheritance, and everything that came with it. Could I really prove her wrong at the first sign of serious opposition? I was still wrestling with these thoughts when my phone rang at 11 p.m. It was Mrs. Whitmore, and she sounded urgent. "Sophia, thank God you answered. I just heard about David's legal filing. You need to come to my office immediately. It's 11 o'clock at night. I know what time it is, dear. This can't wait until morning." 20 minutes later, I was back in Mrs. Whitmore's office, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The elegant space was now cluttered with legal documents, old books, and what appeared to be decades' worth of financial records. Mrs. Whitmore looked like she had aged 10 years since our last meeting. "Sit down, Sophia. There are things about your family's history that I should have told you from the beginning." She poured herself a glass of brandy with shaking hands. "David Rosewood isn't just your cousin. He's the son of Robert Rosewood, your mother's uncle, and he's been trying to get his hands on the family fortune for over 20 years. "What do you mean?" "The Rosewood textile business wasn't just successful, Sophia. It was revolutionary. Your great-grandfather, William Rosewood, invented a manufacturing process in the 1920s that is still used by major fashion companies today. The patents alone are worth millions, and the ongoing royalties have been generating enormous wealth for decades." She pulled out a thick ledger book that looked like it belonged in a museum. "When your grandparents died in that car accident, they left behind an empire worth over $60 million. Your mother inherited it all because she was the only direct heir." My head was spinning again. $60 million? But you said $12 million. That's just what your mother set aside for you. The rest of the money has been sitting in various investments and trusts, growing larger every year. David knows this, and he's been fighting the legal system for 2 decades trying to prove that he deserves a share of it." Mrs. Whitmore opened another file and pulled out a photograph of a younger David Rosewood shaking hands with a man in a business suit. 3 years ago, David finally found a way to potentially claim the fortune. He discovered that Robert Rosewood, his father and your mother's uncle, had been secretly embezzling money from the family business for years before the accident. Robert died in prison, but David has been arguing that his father's crimes were actually a legitimate claim to partnership in the company. That's insane. Yes, but insanity can be very persuasive when it's backed by expensive lawyers and fabricated evidence. She showed me another document, a financial report that made my stomach drop. David has spent the last 3 years systematically destroying evidence of his father's crimes while creating false documentation to support his claims. He's already managed to freeze about $15 million of the estate while his case moves through the courts. I felt like I was drowning in information I couldn't process. So what does this mean for my inheritance? It means that David sees you as the biggest threat to his plans. If you successfully complete your mother's challenges and claim your inheritance, you'll have the legal standing to challenge his fraudulent claims. But if you disappear or renounce your rights, then he gets everything. Exactly. Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward, her expression intense. "Sophia, There's something else. The car accident that killed your grandparents? David's father, Robert, was the one driving. He was drunk, but the family covered it up to avoid scandal. Your mother knew this, and it's part of why she left the family business. I felt like the room was spinning. Are you saying Robert Rosewood killed my grandparents? I'm saying that Robert Rosewood was responsible for their deaths, and David has spent his entire adult life trying to profit from his father's crimes. She pulled out one more document, a handwritten letter in my mother's distinctive script. Your mother left this for you to read if David ever surfaced. She suspected he would eventually try to claim the inheritance. With trembling hands, I unfolded the letter and began to read. My dearest Sophia, if you are reading this, then David has revealed himself, and you now know the truth about our family's tragic history. I want you to understand that the money itself is not what matters. What matters is that the Rosewood legacy, the business, the patents, the ongoing royalties, continues to be used for good rather than greed. Your second challenge will test your ability to see beyond surface appearances and make decisions based on truth rather than fear. Trust Mrs. Whitmore, but more importantly, trust yourself. You are stronger than you know, and you have the power to end this family's cycle of tragedy once and for all. I looked up at Mrs. Whitmore, feeling a strange sense of clarity despite all the chaos. What's my second challenge? She smiled for the first time that evening. Tomorrow, you're going to have lunch with David Rosewood again, but this time, you're going to offer him exactly what he wants. I don't understand. You're going to tell him that you'll renounce your claim to the inheritance. You're going to make him believe that he's won. I stared at her in confusion. But why would I do that? Because sometimes, Sophia, the only way to catch a predator is to make him think you're prey. The next day, I called David and arranged to meet him at the same cafe. I spent the morning rehearsing what I was going to say, trying to perfect the role of a defeated young woman who had been overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. When David arrived, he looked supremely confident. He probably thought I had spent the night crying and realizing how outmatched I was. Sophia, he said, settling into his chair with a satisfied smile, I trust you've had time to consider my offer. I have, I replied, making sure my voice carried just the right note of resignation. You're right. This is all too much for me. I don't understand legal documents. I don't know anything about managing money, and I certainly don't want to spend years fighting in court. His smile widened. I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. But I have some conditions. The smile faltered slightly. What kind of conditions? First, I want $75,000, not $50,000. If I'm walking away from millions, I deserve a little more compensation. David considered this for a moment, then nodded. That's acceptable. Second, I want the money transferred to an account in my name today, before I sign any papers. Also reasonable. And third, I said, looking him directly in the eyes, I want you to admit what your father did to my grandparents. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David's expression went from confident to dangerous in a heartbeat. I have no idea what you're talking about. The car accident, David. I know Robert was driving drunk. I know he killed them. That's a very serious accusation, Sophia, and a very stupid one. I leaned forward, matching his threatening tone. Is it an accusation if it's true? For a long moment, we stared at each other across the small table. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I actually knew, and whether I was enough of a threat to require more drastic action. Finally, he laughed, a cold, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. You know what? Fine. Yes, my father was driving the night your grandparents died. Yes, he was drunk. Yes, he caused the accident that killed them. And you know what else? I'm glad it happened. I felt my blood turn to ice, but I forced myself to stay calm. If you're watching this, and you've ever had to face down someone who wanted to destroy you, please leave a comment about where you're watching from. Because what happened next taught me that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who think they've already won. You're glad your father killed my grandparents? I'm glad because it meant your mother inherited everything instead of having to share it with Robert. And now that she's dead, and you're too weak to fight for it, that inheritance is going to end up exactly where it belongs. With me. Even though your father was a murderer and a thief, David shrugged. My father was a lot of things, but he was also smart enough to position himself to benefit from the family's wealth. The only mistake he made was getting caught embezzling before he could claim his rightful share. So, you think theft and murder are acceptable as long as they're profitable? I think survival of the fittest is the only law that really matters. Your mother was weak. She walked away from power and money to play house with a poor man. You're weak too. You're sitting here ready to give up millions of dollars because you're scared of a little legal pressure." He leaned back in his chair, looking supremely pleased with himself. "But I'm not weak, Sophia. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get what I deserve. And what I deserve is the entire Rosewood fortune." "What about the patents? The ongoing royalties from the manufacturing process?" "All of it. Every patent, every royalty payment, every investment. When you sign those papers today, you'll be giving up your claim to an empire worth over $80 million. I felt a chill run down my spine. He had just admitted to far more than Mrs. Whitmore had told me about. 80 million? Oh yes. It's been a very good 20 years for the Rosewood investments. Did you really think 12 million was all there was? I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. "David, I need to use the restroom. I'll be right back, and then we can finish this." "Don't take too long, Sophia. I have other appointments today." I walked to the back of the cafe, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. But instead of going to the restroom, I slipped out the back door into the alley behind the building. Mrs. Whitmore was waiting for me in her car, exactly as we had planned. "Did you get it all?" I asked as I slipped into the passenger seat. She held up a small recording device with a satisfied smile. Every word. His confession to covering up the accident, his admission that his father was embezzling, and his statement about the true value of the estate. Plus, some lovely threats that will look very interesting to a judge. So, what happens now? Now we go back to my office and file for an emergency injunction to freeze all of David's assets while we present this evidence to the court. By tomorrow morning, he'll be the one facing criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. As we drove away from the cafe, I realized that I had just completed my second challenge without even knowing it. I had looked beyond David's surface threats and discovered the truth about his character. More importantly, I had proven to myself that I could be brave enough to walk into danger when it was necessary to protect what was right. But I was about to learn that David Rosewood was far more dangerous than I had imagined, and our confrontation was just the beginning of a much larger battle. 3 hours after our meeting at the cafe, David Rosewood discovered that his world was falling apart. Mrs. Whitmore had moved with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment for years. By 6 p.m. that evening, emergency injunctions had been filed, David's assets were frozen, and criminal charges were being prepared, based on the recording we had made. But David wasn't going down without a fight. I was in Mrs. Whitmore's office, reviewing the legal documents that would finally grant me access to my inheritance, when her secretary burst through the door without knocking. "Mrs. Whitmore, you need to see the news immediately." She turned on the television, and I felt my stomach drop as I saw my own face filling the screen. It was a photo from my high school yearbook, and the caption underneath read, "Local woman claims false identity to steal millions." The news anchor was speaking in the serious, measured tone reserved for major scandals. "Tonight at 6, we have an exclusive investigation into what appears to be an elaborate fraud scheme involving a young woman who claims to be the heir to a textile fortune." David Rosewood, legitimate heir to the Rosewood estate, held a press conference this afternoon alleging that Sophia Martinez has been using forged documents and false identities to steal his family's inheritance. The screen cut to David standing behind a podium, looking every inch the grieving family member who had been wronged. Behind him stood 3 men in expensive suits who were clearly his legal team. "My family has been devastated by this fraud," David was saying, his voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "This young woman has fabricated an entire identity, claiming to be the daughter of my deceased cousin Isabella. She has created false documents, bribed officials, and manipulated elderly attorneys in an elaborate scheme to steal millions of dollars that rightfully belong to my family." I watched in horror as he held up what appeared to be official documents. "We have proof that Sophia Martinez is not who she claims to be. Her real name is Sofia Valdez, and she is an illegal immigrant who has been using stolen social security numbers and forged birth certificates for years. She targeted the Rosewood family specifically because she knew we were wealthy and vulnerable after the recent death of our patriarch." Mrs. Whitmore muted the television, but we could still see David continuing his performance, complete with tears and dramatic gestures. "How is this possible?" I whispered. "How can he just lie like that on television?" "Because he's desperate," Mrs. Whitmore replied. But I could see the worry in her eyes. "And because he has resources we underestimated." She immediately began making phone calls, trying to contact judges, district attorneys, and other legal officials who could help us respond to David's accusations. But it quickly became clear that David had been planning this counterattack for weeks. Within an hour, Social media was flooded with the story, and Sophia fraud was trending on Twitter, and dozens of fake accounts were sharing supposedly damning evidence about my criminal past. Someone had even created a fake immigration record, showing that I had entered the country illegally as a child. My phone began ringing constantly. Reporters, attorneys, and people claiming to be long-lost relatives who wanted to help me. Mrs. Whitmore had her secretary screen all the calls, but the harassment was relentless. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said, after we had been dealing with the crisis for 3 hours, "maybe I should just give up. This is exactly what David warned me would happen. He's going to destroy my reputation and make my life a living hell." She looked at me with the fierce determination I had come to associate with her. "Sophia, do you remember what your mother wrote in that letter? She said your second challenge would test your ability to see beyond surface appearances and make decisions based on truth rather than fear. But this isn't the second challenge anymore. This is something completely different." "No, my dear. This is your third challenge." I stared at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" She pulled out another envelope, one I hadn't seen before. "Your mother left specific instructions for what to do if David ever launched a public attack against you. She knew him well enough to predict exactly this scenario." With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and read my mother's final message. "My dearest Sophia, if you are reading this, then David has shown his true nature to the world. Your third and final challenge is the most difficult. You must choose between your reputation and your integrity. David will offer you one final deal, a way to make all the public humiliation disappear, in exchange for walking away from your inheritance forever. The easy path is to take his offer and disappear. The hard path is to stand up publicly, tell the truth about everything, and trust that justice will prevail even when it seems impossible. Only by choosing truth over comfort will you prove that you are ready to handle the responsibility that comes with the Rosewood legacy." I looked up at Mrs. Whitmore, finally understanding the full scope of what my mother had planned. She knew this would happen. Isabella was incredibly intelligent, Sophia. She understood that David would eventually show his true colors, and she wanted to make sure you were prepared to face him when he did. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Still want to reconsider my offer? I can make all of this go away in 24 hours. But if you don't take the deal this time, it gets much worse. D." I showed the message to Mrs. Whitmore, who smiled grimly. "He's more scared than he's letting on. David wouldn't be offering you an escape if he was confident in his position. But what if he's right? What if people believe his lies? Then we fight back with the truth. But Sophia, I need to be honest with you about what that means. If we move forward with exposing David's crimes and claiming your inheritance, you will face scrutiny unlike anything you've ever experienced. Every detail of your life will be examined. Every mistake you've ever made will be magnified. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the frightened girl who had been humiliated in that conference room just 2 weeks ago. That girl would have taken David's deal without hesitation, but I wasn't that girl anymore. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm ready to fight." Then tomorrow morning we hold our own press conference, and we tell the world exactly who David Rosewood really is. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the downtown courthouse. Mrs. Whitmore had spent the entire night preparing our response, gathering evidence, and coordinating with law enforcement officials who were now investigating David's fraudulent claims. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined facing a room full of reporters who already believed I was a criminal. Part of me wanted to call David and accept his offer. It would be so much easier to just disappear and start over somewhere else. But every time I considered giving up, I thought about my mother. She had walked away from this fortune once before, but she had made sure I would have the chance to claim it if I proved worthy. How could I let her down now? The morning of the press conference, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, trying to decide what to wear. I had exactly 3 professional outfits, all of them purchased secondhand. I chose a simple black dress, the same one I had worn to the charity gala where this all began. As I looked at my reflection, I realized that everything had come full circle. 2 weeks ago, I had worn this dress as a symbol of my poverty and invisibility. Today, I was wearing it as armor. Mrs. Whitmore picked me up at 9 a.m., and we drove to the courthouse in silence. As we approached the building, I could see the crowd of reporters and cameras already assembled on the front steps. "Remember," Mrs. Whitmore said as we parked, "tell the truth, stay calm, and don't let them provoke you into saying anything you'll regret." We walked through the crowd of reporters, ignoring the shouted questions and camera flashes, and made our way to the small conference room that had been set up for our announcement. At exactly 10 a.m., Mrs. Whitmore stepped up to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Yesterday, David Rosewood held a press conference making several serious allegations against my client, Sophia Martinez. Today, we're here to set the record straight. She gestured for me to join her at the podium. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to walk forward and face the cameras. My name is Sophia Martinez, I began, my voice stronger than I had expected. And everything David Rosewood said about me yesterday was a lie. I pulled out my birth certificate, social security card, and other official documents that proved my identity. I am exactly who I claim to be. I am the daughter of Isabella Rosewood and Jose Martinez. I am a United States citizen, born in this city 24 years ago, and I am the rightful heir to the Rosewood textile fortune. A reporter in the front row raised her hand. Ms. Martinez, do you have any proof that Isabella Rosewood was actually your mother? Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward and held up a DNA test that we had expedited through a private lab. We have definitive genetic proof that Sophia is Isabella Rosewood's biological daughter. We also have medical records, birth certificates, and dozens of other documents that confirm her identity. Another reporter called out, "What about the allegations that you've been using false social security numbers?" "Those allegations are completely fabricated," I replied. "I have used the same social security number my entire life, the one that was issued to me when I was born. David Rosewood has created false documents to support his lies. Then why should we believe you instead of him?" This was the moment I had been dreading. I took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. Because I have proof that David Rosewood is a criminal. The room erupted in excited murmurs. Mrs. Whitmore nodded at me encouragingly. 3 days ago, David Rosewood confessed to me that his father, Robert Rosewood, was driving drunk the night my grandparents were killed in a car accident. He also admitted that Robert had been embezzling money from the family business for years. Most importantly, he told me that he has been systematically destroying evidence and creating false documents to support fraudulent claims to my family's inheritance. I pulled out a small recording device and held it up for the cameras to see. I have audio recordings of David making these confessions. I also have documentation proving that he has filed false legal claims worth over $80 million. The reporters were now shouting questions all at once, but I held up my hand for silence. For the past 3 years, David Rosewood has been using the legal system to steal money that belongs to other people. He has lied to judges, fabricated evidence, and destroyed documents to cover up his father's crimes. Yesterday's press conference was just his latest attempt to deflect attention from his own criminal behavior. If you're still watching this incredible story, and you believe that truth should always win over lies, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what happened next proved that sometimes justice really does prevail. Mrs. Whitmore stepped back up to the podium. As of this morning, the district attorney's office has filed criminal charges against David Rosewood for fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. His assets remain frozen pending a full investigation into his financial crimes. A reporter called out, "Ms. Martinez, what will you do with the inheritance if you're successful in claiming it?" This was the question I had been hoping someone would ask. "The Rosewood textile business has been generating wealth for over a century," I said. "But that wealth was built on the labor and creativity of thousands of workers who were never fairly compensated. If I inherit this fortune, I plan to use it to create scholarships for underprivileged students, fund small business loans for entrepreneurs from poor backgrounds, and support organizations that help children in foster care." I paused, thinking about the girl I had been just 2 weeks ago. I know what it feels like to be invisible, to be treated like you don't matter because you don't have money. No child should have to grow up feeling worthless because of their economic circumstances. If I have the power to change that for even a few people, then my mother's sacrifice will have been worth it. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, but I could see that the mood in the room had shifted. The reporters who had arrived expecting to interrogate a fraud were now listening to a story of justice and redemption. As we left the courthouse, Mrs. Whitmore squeezed my arm. "You did beautifully, Sophia. Your mother would be so proud. Do you think it worked? Do you think people will believe us?" "I think," she said with a smile, "that David Rosewood just made the biggest mistake of his life." 6 weeks later, I was sitting in the same conference room at Henderson and Associates where my journey had begun. But this time, I wasn't there as a cleaning lady being humiliated in front of strangers. I was there as the newly confirmed heir to the Rosewood textile fortune, signing papers that would make me one of the youngest female millionaires in the country. The legal battle with David had been swift and decisive. Once law enforcement began investigating his claims, they discovered a paper trail of fraud, forgery, and financial crimes dating back over 5 years. David was currently awaiting trial on 17 different felony charges, and his lawyers had already begun discussing plea deals. More importantly, the public had rallied around my story in ways I never could have imagined. The press conference had been viewed over 10 million times online, and Dalter Truth Wins had become a trending hashtag for weeks. Thousands of people had shared their own stories of overcoming poverty and standing up to bullies, creating a movement that was much bigger than just my personal situation. Mrs. Whitmore sat beside me as I signed the final documents, her face glowing with satisfaction. $87 million, she said, shaking her head in amazement. The investments have performed even better than we anticipated. It still doesn't feel real, I admitted. Well, you'd better make it feel real quickly, because you have some major decisions to make. She was right. Along with the money came control of the Rosewood textile business, which employed over 3,000 people in factories around the world. I also inherited the patents to my great-grandfather's manufacturing processes, which generated millions in royalties every year. But the most important inheritance wasn't financial. It was the responsibility to use this wealth in a way that honored my mother's values and my own experiences. Over the past month, I had been working with a team of financial advisors and philanthropic experts to create the Isabella Rosewood Foundation. The foundation would focus on 3 main areas: education scholarships for students from low-income families, microloans for entrepreneurs who couldn't get traditional bank financing, and support programs for children aging out of the foster care system. I had also made some personal decisions that surprised even me. Mrs. Whitmore, I said as we finished the paperwork, I want to offer you a position as the chief legal counsel for my foundation. The salary would be triple what you're making now, plus equity participation in all our programs. Her eyes widened. Sophia, that's incredibly generous, but I'm not sure I'm ready to retire from private practice. Who said anything about retiring? I want you to help me build something revolutionary. Imagine what we could accomplish if we had unlimited resources to fight for people who can't fight for themselves. She smiled and extended her hand. When do I start? My next stop was Henderson and Associates. Mr. Henderson had called me 3 times in the past week, asking if I would reconsider his job offer, but I had a different proposal in mind. I found him in his office, looking considerably more humble than he had 2 months ago. Sophia, he said, standing up when I entered. Congratulations on everything. I have to say, watching you handle that press conference was extraordinary. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I actually wanted to talk to you about something. I sat down across from his desk, noting how different the power dynamic felt now. I know you offered me a job as a paralegal, and I appreciate that, but I have a counter-proposal. He leaned forward, clearly intrigued. I want to hire Henderson and Associates as the primary legal firm for my foundation. We're going to be handling hundreds of cases involving employment discrimination, housing rights, and educational access. It would be a multi-million-dollar contract. His eyes widened. That's an incredible opportunity, but there are conditions. First, you would need to hire at least 10 new attorneys, with a focus on diversity and candidates from non-traditional backgrounds. Second, 20% of your billable hours would need to be dedicated to pro bono work. And third, I paused, savoring this moment. You would need to personally apologize to every employee you've ever treated poorly, and commit to sensitivity training for your entire staff. Mr. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with his pride. You know, Sophia, 2 months ago I would have been insulted by those conditions. And now? Now I think they're exactly what this firm needs to become the kind of place I should have been building all along. He extended his hand. You have a deal. As I left his office, I realized that I had just completed a circle of redemption that my mother had probably envisioned when she created those challenges for me. My final stop of the day was the most important one. I drove to Riverside Cemetery, where my mother had been buried 21 years ago. I had only visited her grave a few times over the years. I could never afford flowers, and it was too painful to face the reminder of everything I had lost. But today was different. I knelt beside her headstone, which was simple and modest, just like the life she had chosen. Isabella Martinez, beloved mother, 1975-2003. Hi, Mom, I said softly, placing a bouquet of white roses on her grave. I think you would be proud of the woman I've become. I told her about the foundation, about my plans to use her inheritance to help other people escape poverty, and about how her challenges had taught me that true wealth comes from character, not bank accounts. I finally understand why you walked away from all of this, I continued. Money without purpose is just numbers on a page, but money with a mission can change the world. As I stood to leave, I felt a sense of peace that I had never experienced before. I was no longer the invisible girl who had been humiliated for being poor. I was no longer the victim of other people's cruelty and prejudice. I was Sophia Martinez, daughter of Isabella Rosewood, heir to a fortune built on innovation and hard work. More importantly, I was someone who had proven that true success comes not from what you inherit, but from what you choose to do with the opportunities you're given. 6 months later, the Isabella Rosewood Foundation had awarded its first round of scholarships to 200 students from low-income families. We had funded 150 small business loans for entrepreneurs who had been rejected by traditional banks. And we had created support programs in 12 cities to help foster children transition to independent adulthood. But the achievement I was most proud of was much simpler. I had learned to see myself not as someone who had been lucky enough to inherit money, but as someone who had earned the right to use that money wisely. They humiliated me for being poor, thinking that poverty defined my worth. They were wrong. Poverty had taught me empathy, resilience, and the value of hard work. Wealth had given me the power to turn those lessons into action. And that, I realized, was exactly what my mother had hoped would happen when she decided to trust me with her legacy. If this story inspired you to believe that your circumstances don't define your potential, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, sometimes the universe has to break you down completely before it can build you into the person you were always meant to become.